Alara Tilden gazed out over the sprawling vineyards of Santa Barbara, the sun casting a soft golden hue over the landscape. It was a picture-perfect scene, straight from a magazine cover. The rows of grapevines stretched out before her like an endless tapestry, and beyond them, the majestic hills framed the horizon. She was standing at the edge of the estate, watching as the final touches were made for her wedding, but her mind wasn't fully in the moment. The day she had dreamed of for years had arrived, but there was something tugging at the back of her mind, something she couldn't quite place. The delicate lace of her wedding gown brushed against her legs as she walked, her heels clicking lightly on the cobblestone path. Everything about the day screamed perfection. Her dress, the elegant decorations, the champagne bubbles rising in crystal flutes, but there was a lingering unease. She had worked hard for this, tirelessly building her career as an architect, and now she stood on the precipice of what should have been the happiest day of her life. Still, the weight of the moment seemed heavier than she expected. Her gaze moved across the manicured lawn where guests gathered, chatting and laughing in the soft breeze. They all seemed so happy, so carefree, and yet Alara felt disconnected, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. Her best friend, Victoria, was in the middle of the crowd, her laugh a familiar sound that Alara always loved, but her attention drifted back to the man who was about to become her husband. Silas Montgomery, handsome in his tailored tuxedo, stood by the altar with a broad smile, his dark eyes glinting with pride. Silas had always been charming, the kind of man who made people feel important, who could win you over with just a few well-placed words. It wasn't his wealth or his success that had drawn Alara to him, but something more, a magnetic presence, an undeniable connection that had blossomed into love. She had fallen for his warmth, for the way he made her feel as though she were the most important person in the room. Alara had always been the pragmatic one, the one who focused on goals and achievements. Love had been something she never expected to find, but when Silas had entered her life, everything had shifted. It had been a whirlwind romance, fast and intense, but deep down, Alara knew that this was the life she had always wanted. A partnership built on love and mutual respect, or so she thought. The wedding ceremony was about to begin. As Alara stood there waiting to make her entrance, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She had been so focused on making everything perfect for this moment that she had ignored the small signs, things Silas said, the way he acted at times. There had been moments of tension, brief flashes of distance, but she had brushed them aside, telling herself it was just pre-wedding nerves. But now, standing on the precipice of this monumental step, she wasn't so sure. As she walked down the aisle, all eyes turned toward her. The gentle hum of the string quartet playing in the background seemed to fade as she focused solely on Silas. His smile widened as their eyes locked, and for a fleeting second, Alara felt a spark of reassurance. This was it, the life they would build together. The vows they exchanged were heartfelt, their promises sealed with a kiss that left Alara feeling both elated and apprehensive. Silas was the man she had chosen to spend the rest of her life with. They were a perfect match, at least that's what she had always believed. But now, standing at the altar, in front of their friends and family, she couldn't ignore the tiny voice in her head, urging her to question everything. The reception followed, the evening filled with laughter, music, and dancing. The air was warm with celebration, but Alara found herself retreating to a quiet corner of the venue, needing a moment to herself. She watched Silas as he moved through the crowd, charming their guests as he always did. He was the center of attention, the life of every party, and Alara loved him for it. But tonight, her heart wasn't as light as it should have been. She stepped out onto the terrace, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The moon hung high above, casting a silvery glow on the landscape. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter, the start of a blissful life together. Yet something lingered in the shadows of her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that the perfect life she had envisioned was slipping through her fingers. The night sky stretched endlessly above her, and for the first time that evening, Alara allowed herself a deep breath. She wanted to believe everything would be fine. She wanted to trust Silas completely. But as she gazed out into the distance, she couldn't help but wonder what secrets lay hidden beneath the surface, secrets that could shatter the perfect image they had so carefully constructed. Alara awoke the next morning to the soft sound of waves crashing against the shore. The sun had already risen, casting a warm golden glow over the resort. The island was tranquil, almost too peaceful for someone who had just embarked on the most important journey of her life. Alara stretched in the bed beside Silas, his peaceful breathing betraying the tension she felt in her chest. Despite the excitement of the night before, something deep inside her hadn't settled. There was an unfamiliar unease that gnawed at her as the events of the wedding replayed in her mind. The honeymoon had begun with all the promise of a perfect retreat. The tropical paradise was everything she'd imagined: lush palm trees, clear turquoise waters, and the intimacy that only a secluded island could provide. The resort itself was designed for privacy, with villas set apart by winding pathways, offering guests a world of their own. It was supposed to be a dream come true, but Alara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Silas, still asleep, seemed oblivious to the tension in the air. His dark hair was tousled, his face calm in slumber, and for a moment, Alara allowed herself to forget the doubts creeping in. She wanted to believe it was just the nerves of the big day and the weight of the wedding. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Silas had always been the picture of confidence, charming and charismatic, the type of man who could hold a room's attention with ease. He had swept her off her feet when they first met, and the whirlwind romance had only solidified her belief that they were destined to be together. But now, in the quiet stillness of their honeymoon villa, she couldn't ignore the growing gap between them. Her thoughts drifted back to the wedding, to the moments when she had felt Silas pulling away, almost imperceptibly. It was subtle at first, an odd glance, a fleeting touch, a distraction when they were supposed to be lost in the moment together. When the reception had ended and the guests had left, she thought it would be their time to finally connect. Instead, Silas had been distant, spending more time on his phone than with her. At the time, she had brushed it off, attributing it to wedding stress. But this morning, that sense of being overlooked lingered, as though she were on the outside of a world she had once thought she was a part of. As Silas stirred, Alara quietly slipped out of bed. The villa, with its vast glass windows overlooking the ocean, felt too open, too exposed, but it was a fitting metaphor for the cracks she sensed in their relationship. She made her way to the balcony, taking in the beauty of the landscape. The resort was quiet at this hour, the sound of birdsong mingling with the distant hum of the sea. Alara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze touch her skin, trying to calm the nerves that twisted in her stomach. When she returned to the room, Silas was sitting up in bed, his phone in hand. He smiled at her as she walked back in, his usual warmth and charm evident. But there was something off in his demeanor. He seemed distracted, more so than usual, his eyes flicking to the phone screen as though he was waiting for something, someone. "Alara," Silas said, his voice smooth but distant. "I was thinking we could head out to the beach today. I heard there's a great private spot a bit further down. Just the two of us, no interruptions." Alara nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was on his mind. The way he kept checking his phone, the way he looked at her but didn't seem to really see her, it all felt like a warning sign that she couldn't ignore. She had heard the faint buzz of his phone when she was on the balcony, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now it felt like it had become a symbol of the growing distance between them. After a quick breakfast by the pool, they made their way to the beach. The sand was soft beneath their feet, and the waves lapped gently at the shore, creating a calming rhythm. Silas led the way, his movements purposeful, almost as though he were trying to escape something. Alara followed, trying to push aside the doubts clouding her mind, but they were persistent, like a shadow that grew longer with each step. As they walked, Alara noticed a woman on the far side of the beach, sitting on a towel, reading a book. She looked out of place, with dark, flowing hair and a composed demeanor that set her apart from the other tourists. The woman's presence seemed to command attention, and as Alara glanced at Silas, she caught him looking in her direction. His gaze lingered for just a moment too long before he quickly turned away. But it was enough for Alara to notice, and the feeling of unease in her stomach deepened. They continued their walk in silence, but Alara couldn't stop thinking about the woman and Silas's strange reaction. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she couldn't deny that something about it felt wrong. They returned to their villa, and the rest of the day passed in a blur of half-hearted conversation and forced smiles. Silas was distant, absorbed in his phone again, and Alara couldn't help but feel like an outsider in their own honeymoon. She had hoped for intimacy, for connection, but instead, she felt invisible. Later that evening, as they were having dinner by the water, Alara saw the woman again, this time much closer. The woman walked past their table on her way to the bar, and Alara couldn't help but notice the way she glanced at Silas. It wasn't just a casual glance. It was as though they shared a silent understanding, a familiarity that Alara couldn't ignore. Silas didn't seem to notice, or at least he didn't acknowledge it, but Alara's instincts were telling her something was off. She caught the woman's gaze once more, and this time, the woman smiled. A knowing, almost predatory smile that sent a chill down Alara's spine. Silas had barely acknowledged her presence, but Alara had no doubt that the woman had been following them around for most of the day. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. By the time they returned to their villa, Alara was on edge, her mind racing. She couldn't explain the strange sense of dread that had settled over her, but she knew something was wrong. She lay in bed, Silas beside her, and tried to sleep, but her mind refused to quiet. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman's face and Silas's distracted gaze. That night, Alara decided she had to know the truth. She would confront Silas about the woman in the morning. She needed answers, and she couldn't continue like this, pretending everything was fine. But as she drifted into a fitful sleep, a part of her wondered if confronting him would bring the answers she sought, or if it would unravel something far darker than she was prepared for. The night passed in an unsettling quiet. Alara lay awake beside Silas, unable to find rest. The villa, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed too open, too exposed. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows made her heart race. She had expected to wake up to the tranquility of a honeymoon, to the warmth of Silas by her side, and the promise of peaceful days ahead. But that peace had been replaced by a nagging unease she couldn't shake. The excitement of the wedding had worn off, and now the weight of the unspoken distance between them seemed heavier than ever. In the morning, Alara woke to find the bed beside her empty. Silas was gone. There was no note, no sign of him having left, and his phone, which had been on the nightstand the night before, was nowhere to be found. Alara's stomach churned with confusion and concern. She sat up in bed, scanning the room for any sign of where he had gone. The villa felt too still, too quiet, and the absence of Silas only made the silence more pronounced. She tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Alara made her way outside, hoping to find him by the beach or the pool. The island, so lush and beautiful, now felt isolated and suffocating. She walked along the quiet paths of the resort, her footsteps echoing through the stillness. But there was no sign of Silas. She passed a few other guests lounging by the pool, but none seemed to have any answers. It was as though Silas had simply vanished. As Alara continued her search, her mind raced with questions. Had something happened to him? Why had he disappeared without telling her? Her anxiety grew with every minute that passed, and a sense of dread began to settle in the pit of her stomach. She needed to find him. She needed answers. Alara reached the beach, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Silas. The ocean stretched out before her, its vastness seemingly endless, and yet it felt as though something was lurking just beyond the surface. The waves rolled in softly, almost soothingly, but to Alara, they only seemed to underscore the growing tension in her chest. She walked along the shoreline, hoping to spot him in the distance. Then, just as she was about to turn back, she saw something that stopped her dead in her tracks. The woman, Giselle, was sitting alone on the beach near the rocks, gazing out at the ocean. Her posture was too calm, too composed for someone who was just another guest at the resort. She was not engaged in the carefree relaxation that most of the other vacationers were enjoying. Instead, she seemed to be waiting, watching as though she were a part of the island itself, something intangible and unsettling. Alara's heart skipped a beat. She had been trying to push the thoughts of Giselle out of her mind, but now, seeing her again, so out of place and yet so at home, Alara's suspicions flared up once more. There was no logical reason for Giselle to be here, no reason for her to be lingering around the resort. And yet, there she was, sitting as if she belonged. Giselle turned her head, catching Alara's gaze from across the beach. There was no surprise in her expression, no recognition of the awkwardness that might have been expected. Instead, her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Alara couldn't place it, but something about that smile made her blood run cold. It was almost as if Giselle had been expecting Alara to find her, like she was a part of something Alara hadn't yet figured out. Alara's feet felt frozen to the sand, her instincts telling her to leave, to walk away from the unsettling scene. But instead, she took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. Giselle didn't move. Her gaze never wavered from Alara's. The silence between them was thick, like a wall that Alara couldn't breach. In the distance, Alara spotted Silas approaching. He was walking toward her, his steps slow but steady. As he drew closer, Alara's tension did not ease. There was a strange emptiness in the way he moved, as if he were unaware of the storm of questions brewing inside her. His eyes flicked briefly to Giselle, and then quickly away, his expression unreadable. Alara wanted to ask him, to demand to know what was happening, but she could not find the words. Something inside her told her that asking him would only lead to more confusion, more lies. Without a word, Silas walked past Alara, his face blank. He didn't stop. He didn't acknowledge her presence. It was as if they were strangers, as if nothing had happened between them, not even the past hours of confusion and silence. The hollow feeling in Alara deepened. What was going on? Why was he acting like nothing had changed? As Silas disappeared around the corner of the villa, Alara felt her world tilt. Everything she thought she knew, everything she had trusted, felt like it was slipping out of her grasp. She glanced back at Giselle, still seated on the beach, staring out at the horizon, as though nothing had changed for her, as though she were a part of something much larger than Alara could understand. Alara turned away, her heart racing, her mind spinning. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay in this place that had once promised tranquility, only to become a maze of unanswered questions. She needed to figure this out. She needed to find the truth, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it shattered the illusions she had built in her mind. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its harsh light on the beach, but all Alara could see were shadows. Silas's disappearance, Giselle's cryptic presence, the way they seemed to share an understanding that Alara could never be a part of. It all became too much to ignore. Her honeymoon had become a nightmare, and she was trapped in the middle of it, unable to find a way out. The day wore on in a haze of confusion for Alara. She had tried to push aside the gnawing feeling in her gut, to tell herself that everything was fine, that Silas's behavior was just a temporary lapse. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. Something wasn't right. Silas had disappeared without explanation, and Giselle's sudden appearance on the island only deepened the mystery. That night, the resort seemed darker than usual. The air felt thick with tension, and every sound amplified in the silence. The gentle hum of the ocean, the rustling of palm fronds in the breeze, the distant murmur of guests in their rooms. Alara couldn't escape the feeling that something was about to happen, something she wasn't prepared for. She lay awake in their bed, the space beside her cold and empty. Silas had returned hours ago, but he had hardly acknowledged her, retreating into a silence that was colder than the ocean breeze. Alara wanted to reach out to him, to ask him about Giselle, about the strange tension she felt between them, but she couldn't. Her heart told her that asking would only open doors she wasn't ready to walk through. It wasn't just Silas's sudden detachment that worried her. It was the way he seemed to avoid her questions, as though he knew something she didn't. And the thought of Giselle on the island, lingering like a ghost from the past, only added to the growing unease. The next morning, Alara tried to act normal, to push the doubts aside. She followed Silas down to the resort's dining area for breakfast, trying to ignore the pit in her stomach. The meal passed in awkward silence. Silas seemed distant, his eyes glued to his phone as if he were waiting for something. Alara wanted to ask him where he'd gone last night, why he had been so distant, but the words wouldn't come. She watched him, her thoughts racing, unable to understand the man she had married. After breakfast, Alara walked down to the beach, trying to clear her mind. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore should have been soothing, but all it did was amplify the pounding in her chest. The sun was bright and the air was warm, but it didn't matter. Nothing felt right anymore. Silas, the man she had trusted, seemed like a stranger, and Giselle's presence loomed over her like a shadow. She reached the spot where she had seen Giselle the day before, and to her surprise, the woman was there again, sitting by the rocks, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Alara hesitated, unsure of what to do. She couldn't just walk away. Something inside her told her that she needed to confront this, to understand what was going on. But as she took a step forward, a figure appeared behind her. Silas. He walked toward her with a purpose, but there was something in his stride that felt off, something that Alara couldn't put her finger on. She turned to face him, her heart racing. He said nothing, his eyes distant, as though they weren't really connected. She wanted to ask him about Giselle, about what was happening between them, but instead, she stood there speechless. Giselle looked up at them, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, but her eyes flicked between Alara and Silas, a silent understanding passing between them. Alara felt the weight of that gaze, the heaviness of the past that neither Silas nor Giselle seemed willing to acknowledge. As Silas and Alara stood there, the tension between them palpable, Alara couldn't help but feel like an outsider. She had once thought that she was part of this world with Silas, that their love was something solid and unshakable. But now, it felt as though the ground beneath her feet was shifting, and she had no idea how to keep up. Later that afternoon, Alara walked along the beach again, her mind racing with questions and doubts. She couldn't escape the nagging feeling that Silas was hiding something from her, something big, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it had something to do with Giselle, the way Silas had reacted when she saw them together, the way he had barely looked at her, the way Giselle had been watching them. It all pointed to something she didn't want to believe. She had seen the way Silas had acted when he thought she wasn't looking. His quick glances, his avoidance, the way his phone had buzzed constantly in his pocket. The small details, the ones that should have been insignificant, all started to fit together in a picture she didn't want to see. Giselle wasn't just some woman from Silas's past. She was part of something darker, something Alara wasn't prepared for. As Alara stood by the edge of the water, staring out at the endless horizon, she felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea what was really going on, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't ignore this anymore. The perfect honeymoon, the dream she had built in her mind, had already started to crumble. And the more she tried to hold on to it, the more she realized she was losing control. The silence of the island was deafening. The beauty of the surroundings only served to highlight the emptiness that had begun to take root in her heart. Alara had always prided herself on her ability to stay grounded, to stay in control. But now, as she stood there looking out at the ocean, she knew that the perfect life she had imagined with Silas was slipping further and further away. The truth, she feared, was something she wasn't ready to face. But the more she looked at the horizon, the more she realized that she had no choice. She had to face it. Whatever secret Silas was hiding, whatever Giselle had to do with it, Alara knew she was about to uncover a reality far darker than she had ever imagined. The morning after Alara's encounter with Giselle, the air around the resort felt heavier. The island, which had once seemed like a serene paradise, now felt like a cage. Alara had tried to shake off the unease from the day before, but every part of her mind, every instinct told her that something was terribly wrong. Silas's distant behavior, Giselle's cryptic presence, and the growing disconnection between her and her husband were all pieces of a puzzle that she wasn't sure she was ready to solve. By mid-morning, Alara's thoughts had spiraled so far out of control that she couldn't bear to stay in the villa any longer. She needed answers, and she knew there was only one place to find them. She decided to follow Silas. She had to know where he had been going when he disappeared earlier, what he was hiding, and why everything seemed so wrong. The silence between them had become unbearable. She waited until Silas stepped outside for his usual routine of walking down to the resort's main building. He hadn't even acknowledged her that morning, and she couldn't help but notice the way he seemed to hurry off whenever they were in the same space, as if there was something he couldn't let her see. It was as if he had been deliberately pulling away, and the more she tried to make sense of it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just some passing phase. There was something darker, more sinister that lay at the heart of their unraveling relationship. Alara trailed behind him discreetly, careful not to be seen. She stayed a few paces back, keeping her distance while making sure she could still keep him in sight. Silas walked briskly through the paths leading to the beach, towards the small, private cove on the far side of the resort. The area was often deserted, a hidden part of the island that many guests never ventured to. Alara's heart quickened as she followed him down the narrow, winding trail, the sense of foreboding growing with each step. When Silas reached the secluded cove, Alara paused, hiding behind the trees that lined the trail. From her vantage point, she could see him sitting on a large boulder overlooking the water. His posture was tense, rigid, as if he were waiting for someone. Alara's stomach churned, the unease returning with full force. The silence of the moment seemed too deliberate, too charged with anticipation. She waited, unsure of what would happen next, but knowing deep down that this moment would bring her closer to the truth. A short while later, a figure appeared from the brush on the far side of the cove. Alara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the woman, Giselle. She moved toward Silas with a confident stride, her every step deliberate, as if this meeting had been planned all along. The way she approached him, the ease with which they interacted, was more than just a casual encounter. It was the undeniable connection between two people who had shared a past that Alara had no part in. Alara's pulse raced as she watched them, her mind spinning with questions. What were they talking about? What was going on between them? She strained to hear their conversation, but the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the rocks drowned out their words. The brief glimpses of their body language, however, spoke volumes. Giselle's movements were smooth and calculated, her gaze never straying too far from Silas. Silas, on the other hand, appeared less certain, as though he was caught between something he no longer wanted to be a part of and the pull of an old toxic relationship he couldn't let go of. For a moment, Alara considered confronting them right then and there. She wanted to walk out from the shadows and demand the truth from both of them, but something held her back. She needed more than just a confrontation. She needed proof. She needed to understand the full extent of their betrayal. The conversation seemed to end as abruptly as it had started. Silas stood up, his shoulders tense, and Giselle turned to leave, her back straight, her movements purposeful. As she passed Alara's hiding spot, their eyes met for a brief moment. The look on Giselle's face was not one of guilt or shame, but of quiet triumph, as though she had won something Alara had never even known she was fighting for. The coldness in that gaze sent a chill down Alara's spine. When Giselle was out of sight, Alara stepped out from behind the trees, her legs shaky as she approached Silas. He didn't notice her at first, his back turned as he stared out at the ocean, lost in thought. Alara's heart raced in her chest, and for a moment, she wasn't sure what she would say, how she would confront him. But the silence between them, the weight of the years they had spent together, demanded it. When Silas turned to face her, the mask of calm he wore faltered. His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time in days, Alara saw something more than just attachment. There was fear in his gaze, fear of being caught, fear of losing control. Alara knew she couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that they were still the couple they once were. She had seen enough. She didn't need to ask questions. She already knew the answers. Silas had been seeing Giselle behind her back, but the truth was darker than just an affair. It was a betrayal that ran deeper than she had ever imagined. Silas hadn't just been hiding his past, he had been hiding a life that had never truly ended, a life with a woman he had never fully let go of. Giselle wasn't just an ex-lover, she was the mother of Silas's child. Alara's world tilted as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. Silas and Giselle had a child together, a child Alara had never known about. The weight of that knowledge slammed into her chest, suffocating her. She had married a man who had kept this from her, a man who had made promises of love and fidelity while secretly clinging to a life he had never truly let go of. Everything they had built together was a lie, and the truth was something far darker than she could have ever imagined. As Alara turned and walked away from Silas, her mind raced with the implications of what she had just uncovered. The life she had envisioned with him, the dreams they had shared, the plans they had made, were now shattered beyond repair. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved, had been keeping secrets that were too big to ignore, too painful to forgive. The honeymoon, which had started as a dream, had become a nightmare, and Alara knew that this was just the beginning of a far more dangerous journey, one that would expose more than just Silas's betrayal. It would expose a dark, twisted plan that would change everything. The weight of the truth hit Alara harder than she could have anticipated. It was as if the very ground beneath her had cracked open, revealing a chasm that threatened to swallow her whole. Silas had been keeping secrets, secrets far darker and more dangerous than the affair with Giselle. The revelation that he had a child with her was only the beginning. Alara had learned to trust him, to believe in their love, but now everything she thought she knew was crumbling. The moments that followed were a blur of confusion and disbelief. Silas had tried to explain himself, but his words felt hollow, empty. Nothing he said could erase the truth. Their relationship had been built on lies, on manipulation, on a foundation that was far more fragile than she had ever imagined. She couldn't stay in the villa any longer. The sight of Silas, the man she had trusted with her heart, had become unbearable. His presence, once a source of comfort, now felt like a threat, one that Alara had to escape. She packed a bag quickly, stuffing her belongings into the suitcase without even thinking. The thought of leaving, of cutting ties with everything she had known, terrified her. But staying, pretending everything was fine, was no longer an option. She didn't know where to go, but she couldn't remain trapped in that place. The island, the resort, had become suffocating. It had once felt like a dream, a retreat to celebrate their love. But now, it felt like a prison. Alara left the villa, her mind racing. She walked through the resort in a daze, her feet carrying her to the beach, where the waves crashed against the shore. The rhythm of the ocean should have been calming, but all it did was remind her of how far she had fallen, how much had slipped through her fingers. She needed answers. She needed to understand why Silas had done this, why he had kept this secret from her for so long. Why had he lied about Giselle, about the child, about everything? It wasn't until later that day that Alara found herself standing in front of the secluded cove where Silas and Giselle had met earlier. The thought of confronting them again made her stomach churn, but something inside her told her that she needed to know the full extent of their relationship. If she was going to leave, to cut ties with Silas, she needed to understand just how deep the deception ran. The cove was quiet, the soft rustle of leaves the only sound in the otherwise still air. Alara stepped closer, keeping herself hidden behind the rocks that lined the shore. She could see Silas sitting on a boulder, his back to her, staring out at the ocean. His posture was stiff, rigid, and for the first time, Alara saw the vulnerability in him, something she hadn't seen before. He was no longer the man who had promised her the world. He was a man who had been hiding something, someone, and now that truth was threatening to consume him. It didn't take long for Giselle to appear. She walked toward Silas with the same confident stride she had when Alara first saw her on the beach. The way they looked at each other, the way their bodies seemed to move in sync, made Alara's stomach tighten. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a past affair. It wasn't something Silas could pretend had ended long ago. This was an ongoing connection, one that had never truly been severed. Alara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched them. The sight of them together, their shared glances, the familiarity in the way they stood close, was all the confirmation she needed. Silas and Giselle were not just bound by a child. There was a deeper, more insidious bond between them, one that Alara had never even suspected. It was as if the truth had always been right in front of her, hidden beneath layers of lies and half-truths. As the minutes passed, Alara's anger began to boil over. She had tried to remain calm, to find a way to confront Silas without losing control. But now, standing in the shadows, watching him with Giselle, she couldn't hold it in anymore. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make him explain himself. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't change anything. The truth was already out there, and no amount of confrontation would make Silas suddenly honest. What was more terrifying than the betrayal, however, was the realization that Alara was in danger. She had always thought of her life with Silas as a safe haven, a place of love and security. But now, it felt as though she was trapped in a web of lies that extended far beyond just Silas and Giselle. There was something more, something deeper at play, something she hadn't yet seen. Silas and Giselle finally parted ways, their conversation ending with a shared, knowing look. Alara stepped back, her mind racing, trying to piece together what she had just witnessed. She couldn't stay in this place any longer. She couldn't keep living in this nightmare, watching the man she loved slip further away from her. As she turned to leave, something inside her snapped. She needed to confront Silas once and for all. She had to know the full extent of his betrayal. She couldn't live with the unknown any longer. Later that evening, when Silas was alone in their villa, Alara returned. She had made up her mind. She would face him, demand the truth, and finally understand what had been going on behind her back. But when she entered the villa, she was greeted with an empty room. Silas was gone again. This time, however, Alara didn't feel the same fear or anxiety. She had learned enough. The truth was no longer a mystery. It was a stark, painful reality. Silas had lied to her, and so had Giselle. They had plotted together, manipulated her into believing their lies. And now Alara was left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. But it wasn't just her heart that was broken. It was her life, the life she had built with Silas, that was shattered. And now, with the truth out in the open, Alara realized just how deep the betrayal ran. Silas and Giselle weren't just lovers. They were partners in something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. and the web they had spun around her was only just beginning to unravel. The next few days felt like a blur for Alara. The walls of the villa, once a sanctuary, had become her prison. Each corner, each shadow seemed to remind her of the secrets Silas had hidden from her, the life he had lived outside of their marriage, the relationship he had with Giselle, one that was far deeper and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Yet it wasn't just the pain of betrayal that weighed on her. It was the realization that she had been manipulated, deceived by the man she thought she knew. The perfect honeymoon had turned into an inescapable nightmare. Alara could no longer remain passive, waiting for Silas to come clean. She had seen enough to know that his actions and Giselle's involvement weren't just the result of a failed relationship. They were part of something larger, something far darker. Alara needed answers, and if Silas wouldn't give them to her, she would find them herself. She had no other choice. She reached out to the local authorities, to Detective Riley Cooper, a seasoned investigator known for his sharp instincts and meticulous approach to solving even the most complex cases. Alara had kept quiet at first, not wanting to believe the worst. But now that she had uncovered the web of lies, she knew she had to act. She couldn't trust Silas anymore. The safety of her own future depended on knowing the full truth. Detective Cooper took Alara's case seriously from the start. He had seen too many cases where deceit and manipulation ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. Alara, though emotionally devastated, was determined, and her testimony, combined with the physical evidence she had uncovered, pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Something had gone horribly wrong between Silas and Giselle, and it was much more than an affair. In the days that followed, the investigation began to unfold. It was not just a personal betrayal. The truth, as Alara quickly discovered, went far beyond a mere love triangle. As the detective dug deeper into Silas and Giselle's past, he uncovered disturbing information. Silas's finances, which he had always claimed were secure, were in ruin. Business ventures that seemed promising had collapsed, leaving him with mounting debts. It was becoming increasingly clear that his relationship with Giselle was not based on love or nostalgia, but on something far more sinister: financial manipulation. Giselle, it turned out, had a history of manipulating wealthy men, using their affections to gain access to their money and resources. She wasn't just some heartbroken lover clinging to a past romance. She was a skilled con artist, one who knew how to pull strings from behind the scenes. Silas had been her latest target, and Alara was the collateral damage in a carefully orchestrated plan. The deeper the investigation went, the more disturbing the revelations became. Giselle and Silas hadn't just rekindled their affair. They had been planning something much larger. The affair, the child, the financial ruin. It was all part of a carefully calculated scheme. Silas had been led to believe that once Alara was out of the picture, everything would fall into place. They had even planned to steal the remainder of Alara's wealth and then disappear together, leaving nothing but wreckage in their wake. As Detective Cooper pieced the evidence together, the truth began to form a chilling picture. Silas, in his desperation, had been cornered by his mounting debts. Giselle had used her influence over him, twisting him into doing her bidding. The murder of Alara was not an accident, not a spontaneous crime of passion. It was premeditated. Alara had been a pawn in a game that Giselle had been playing for years. Silas, either too weak or too blinded by his feelings for Giselle, had played right into her hands. It was the moment Alara had feared most, the moment when she realized just how deep the conspiracy went. Silas hadn't just lied to her about his relationship with Giselle. He had been complicit in her plans. He had helped orchestrate her manipulation of Alara, knowing full well that Giselle had intended to steal from her and leave her with nothing. The day Alara finally confronted Silas was the day the investigation took its most dramatic turn. Detective Cooper had gathered enough evidence to make an arrest. They had traced the financial transactions between Silas, Giselle, and various offshore accounts that led back to Giselle's network. The pieces fell into place, and the investigation was about to go public. But Alara's confrontation with Silas, the man she had once loved, would reveal more than just the truth about the financial schemes. It would expose the chilling depths of Silas's betrayal, as well as the role Giselle had played in his downward spiral. Alara's heart ached as she looked at Silas in the interrogation room. The man who had once held her heart now looked like a shell of the person she had married. His face was pale, his hands trembling as the detective laid out the evidence before him. For a moment, it seemed as if he might break, as if the truth would finally push him to the edge. But instead of the remorse Alara had hoped for, there was only a cold, calculated silence. Silas's voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of the warmth Alara had once loved. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't even surprised. He had known this moment was coming. He had known that the truth would eventually come to light, but he didn't care. His eyes flicked to Alara, and in that moment, she realized that the man sitting before her was no longer someone she could recognize. He had been consumed by his greed, his need for control, and now, as the consequences of his actions began to catch up to him, there was nothing left of the man she had once trusted. Giselle, too, was brought in for questioning. She was as cold and calculating as ever, her composure unshaken even in the face of the mounting evidence against her. She had played the game too long, and now, with everything unraveling, she showed no remorse. In her eyes, Alara was just another obstacle to be removed, another casualty in her pursuit of power and wealth. The investigation continued to gather momentum. Detective Cooper had already pieced together the financial records, the phone logs, and the witnesses who had seen Silas and Giselle together, conspiring in plain sight. But it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. It was about the lengths they had gone to keep Alara in the dark while they planned her downfall. For Alara, the investigation was a cruel reminder of the life she had once dreamed of, a life that had been shattered by lies, by deceit, by people she thought she could trust. The pieces of her life, her marriage, her love for Silas all lay in ruins, but the truth had set her free, and now with the full scope of the conspiracy revealed, she had a chance to rebuild, to take back control. As Silas and Giselle were arrested and led away, Alara stood in the shadows, watching the two people who had destroyed her world. The anger inside her had burned through every layer of grief, every shred of hope she had once clung to. She had been betrayed in the most unforgivable way, and yet as the police took them away, Alara realized that she was no longer the victim. She had taken back her life. The betrayal had been horrific, but it had not broken her. It had only made her stronger. The investigation, though painful, had given her closure. Silas and Giselle would face the consequences of their actions, and Alara would begin the long process of healing. It was a bitter victory, but it was hers. And now, as the weight of the past slowly began to lift, she could see the path ahead, one that was hers to walk, free from the shadows of the past. The days following Silas and Giselle's arrest passed in a blur. Alara had been thrust into the glare of public scrutiny, her private life exposed for the world to see. The media coverage was relentless. The headlines relentless in their portrayal of the once perfect marriage turned tragic. The investigation, which had revealed the extent of Silas and Giselle's manipulation, left Alara with more questions than answers. But it also gave her something else: closure. The trial began weeks after the arrests. Silas and Giselle were both charged with conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of Alara. The courtroom was filled with tension as the prosecution presented its case, laying bare the twisted web of lies they had spun. Silas, in the face of overwhelming evidence, had no choice but to plead guilty. Giselle, on the other hand, remained defiant, claiming that her actions were justified, that she had done what was necessary to secure a future for herself and her child. But her words fell on deaf ears, as the jury saw her for what she truly was: a master manipulator, someone willing to destroy anyone who stood in her way. Alara sat through every day of the trial, her heart heavy but resolute. The first few days had been unbearable, the memories of her marriage to Silas still fresh and painful. She had loved him, trusted him, believed in him. Now she was forced to confront the reality that the man she had married had never truly existed. He had been a stranger in a mask, playing a part to secure his own future, willing to destroy everything in his path, including her. As the trial progressed, Alara's resolve only grew stronger. She was no longer the broken woman who had stumbled through the days after Silas's betrayal. She had taken control of her life again. The evidence was irrefutable, the testimonies overwhelming. Giselle's manipulations were laid bare for the world to see. Silas, the man who had once promised to stand by her side, was now just another criminal, sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, Alara felt a strange sense of release. The pain hadn't gone away, not completely, The scars from Silas's betrayal would always remain, but she had reclaimed her power. She had faced the truth, confronted the lies, and now she was free. In the months that followed, Alara began the process of rebuilding her life. She sold the villa, the place where they had once dreamt of a future together. The memories it held were too painful, too deeply tied to the life she had lost. It wasn't just the physical space that had to be left behind. It was everything it represented. The life that Silas and Giselle had built at her expense. The lies, the manipulation, couldn't be erased, but she could move forward. She moved back to the city, to a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For the first time in a long while, Alara felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. The city, bustling with its own rhythm and energy, felt like a fresh start. She was free to create her own future, to decide who she wanted to be, to reclaim the woman she had once been before Silas had entered her life. The scars of betrayal ran deep, but Alara refused to let them define her. She focused on her work, throwing herself into her architectural projects with a renewed sense of purpose. She had always been passionate about design, but now it was more than just a career. It was her way of rebuilding, of creating something new from the ashes of her past. Her friends, those who had supported her through the darkest days of the trial, remained by her side. Victoria, her best friend, was a constant source of comfort, reminding Alara that she was not alone. There were moments of doubt, moments when the pain resurfaced, but with each passing day, Alara grew stronger. She realized that the life she had imagined with Silas wasn't the life she had wanted after all. It had been a dream built on false promises, and now she was awake, facing a future full of possibility. The trial was over, but the consequences of Silas and Giselle's actions would linger. Silas was sentenced to life in prison, his wealth and power meaningless in the face of the crimes he had committed. Giselle, too, was given a lengthy sentence, her once perfect plan to escape justice dashed by her own arrogance. Neither of them would ever see the outside world again, and while that gave Alara a sense of justice, it did little to erase the pain they had caused. Alara stood by the window of her new apartment one evening, watching the sunset over the skyline. The city stretched out before her, vibrant and alive, full of promise. For the first time in a long while, Alara felt hopeful. She was no longer a victim of the lies she had been fed. She had faced the truth, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her life. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments of darkness, moments when the pain threatened to return, but Alara knew she was strong enough to face it. She had survived the betrayal, and now she was ready to rebuild. The scars from her past would always remain, but they no longer defined her. She was free, free from the lies, free from the manipulation, free from the man who had tried to control her. And as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Alara smiled, knowing that her new life had only just begun. The case of Alara, Silas, and Giselle teaches us the profound consequences of betrayal and the enduring power of truth. At its core, this story is a stark reminder of how easily trust can be exploited, how manipulation and deceit can warp even the most genuine relationships. Silas and Giselle's actions were driven by greed, jealousy, and a desperate desire to control, which ultimately led to their destruction. Their betrayal wasn't just a betrayal of love, but of everything that Alara had built her life upon: trust, integrity, and shared dreams. However, the true lesson lies in Alara's journey of recovery. Though her life was shattered by the lies and betrayal of those closest to her, she did not remain a victim. Through the darkness, Alara found her inner strength. She chose to face the truth no matter how painful, and rebuilt her life from the ruins. Her resilience was not born from a desire for revenge, but from a desire to reclaim her own agency and forge a new path. In the end, this story is not just about the damage that betrayal can inflict, but about the power of facing the truth, even when it is difficult. It reminds us that while we cannot control the actions of others, we can control how we respond. Healing takes time, and the scars may never fully fade, but with courage, the ability to confront the past, and the support of those who care, we can always move forward. The real victory lies not in revenge, but in finding peace within ourselves. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.